In the labyrinthine heart of Florence, where alleyways festered and the stink of spoiled fruit lingered in every breath, Paolo's story began, not as a legend, but as a festering rumor crawling through the cobblestones. His studio stood on Via della Scala, a crumbling building whose ochre plaster peeled like sickly flesh and whose shutters, even under high sun, were nailed shut against the judging eyes of the city. By the turn of the year 1572, Paolo was a name whispered urgently in butchers' stalls and perfumers' shops. His hands, milk-white and almost bluish in the chill, were said to bring divinity or doom to those who modeled for him. Women passed him in the piazza and shivered, men eyed the haunted set of his shoulders, wondering aloud if the weight of the dead pressed down on him as he walked. Nights in Florence were never silent, but somehow, near Paolo's studio, the air itself held its breath. Grocers and bakers, closing shop well after dusk, would flinch at the sound of a single, frantic brush scraping canvas in the gloom. Dogs whined at locked doors, nuzzling for comfort as the city exhaled its secrets and drew in new horrors. Within, Paolo labored, candlelight trembling across rows of unfinished portraits, faces beautiful and terrifying in their realism. Yet each one, no matter how vibrant the eyes or alive the skin, was marred by the same unspoken curse, lips gilded and pressed shut beneath sheet after sheet of golden lacquer, as if a mute torment could spill from them with a single breath. It was not always so. Stories clung to Paolo like ivy, tales of a young genius who had once painted laughter into the lines of his patrons, whose first works had adorned the halls of newlywed countesses and basked in the envy of rival artists. But something had broken in him in the waning months of the previous winter, a shattering silence after his mother's funeral, a night when neighbors claimed to see him dragging bundles over frozen cobblestones toward the Arno. No one dared question the shift directly, but the city's tongues wagged relentlessly. They spoke of a change in his eyes, a glassy vacancy, as if Paolo no longer saw faces, but the dark shapes behind them. His studio became at once a sanctuary for the desperate and a crucible of terror. Suppliants came to him seeking immortality, frightened into stillness by Paolo's fevered focus, the veiled threat in his every gesture. His pale hands would hover centimeters from their faces, as if measuring not their beauty, but their fragility. Always, the session ended with their lips bound in the painting, locked forever behind a sheen of gold. Rumor claimed Paolo had discovered something unholy in silence, something so profound it gnawed away all other ambitions. Visitors remarked on the stench in his rooms, a sweet, cloying aroma, like wilted lilies or spilled honey gone sour. They blamed the decaying wood, but servants soon fled, muttering of shrouded jars tucked beneath workbenches and strange stains that no amount of scrubbing could erase. As spring drew near, anxiety bloomed in the lungs of Florence. The city's rhythm slowed near Paolo's quarters, not a single child skipped across his shadow. Darker stories took root, those who sat for the artist did not return the same, if at all. Faces, once proud and loud, began to look hunched in windows, their lips trembling at the edge of every conversation, as if some part of themselves had been scraped away and sealed under layers of toxic gold. By the feast of St. Mark, 3 families had boarded up their homes after sudden disappearances, their heirs nowhere to be found, their portraits delivered in secret and hung with trembling hands in the coldest rooms. Each frame echoed Paolo's spreading twilight, a warning and a relic, both altarpiece and tombstone. None could say if Paolo worked under some ancient compulsion or by the whisper of the city's shadows, or if the city itself, sick with memory and regret, had merely conjured its own specter in his work. Yet each night, as fog crept from the river and the bells in Santa Maria Novella tolled for the lost, Paolo's candle burned on, even when the rest of Florence prayed for darkness to devour his light. Behind the nailed shutter, the painter dragged gold across canvas, sealing his model's last shouts in eternal silence, each portrait more menacing, more mournful, another echo in the ever-growing crypt of forbidden beauty. And by dawn, only an acrid scent and the scratch of brush on wood marked his passage through another night. The city pulsed onward, restless, never daring to ask what new face would next be silenced forever. The winter of Florence in the year 1572 ushered in a numbness that crept deeper than the biting winds. A glossy darkness pooled between each twisted street, climbing the flanks of old stone, until the city seemed suspended in some waking hush. Near the edge of a bustling piazza, Paolo's studio waited. Its warped door, hammered from blackened wood, was always shut just a moment too long, opening only to the select few who braved the chill for a taste of deathless beauty. They came in ones and twos, patricians in velvet cloaks and hollow-eyed widows, each drawn by a rumor blooming like rot, immortality, captured in color and sealed by Paolo's strange, steady hand. What greeted them inside the studio was equal parts cathedral and crypt. The lanterns cast rings of light upon the rough-hewn floorboards, illuminating a feverish disarray, porcelain vials brimming with jewel-toned oils, torn sheafs of parchment crawling with frantic sketches, canvases stacked like stacked sarcophagi. The air, thick with the fatty tang of varnish and an undercurrent of something sickly sweet, invaded the nostrils and clung to clothes until the city's smells vanished entirely. Behind his easel, Paolo waited with the patience of a grave digger, his gaze as pale as his paint-streaked skin. He regarded the would-be subjects as puzzles, lost causes and gods, supplicants and sacrifices, who would surrender their likeness to him and, with it, something intangible they would never get back. As gossip proliferated through the tavern corners and church pews, those who sat for Paolo grew increasingly insular. Soon after their portrait session, each began to avoid the noon bustle, shrinking from fountains and markets where they once held court. Neighbors recalled the change with a shudder, the way Amelia de Ferrasi, once famed for her unbroken laughter, now pressed her hand to her mouth whenever she passed a mirror. Mornings found the windows of once vibrant homes shuttered tight, curtains drawn even when the city resounded with bells and the markets brimmed with song. Behind those drawn curtains, a strange stillness bred. The silence of the portraits radiated outward, infecting the halls with their heavy hush until even servants tiptoed warily, as if noise itself had become forbidden. Most chilling were the nights, when Florence drifted into uneasy slumber, yet near Paolo's studio the darkness was rarely left to its own. Neighbors, too disturbed by what they'd heard to sleep, whispered of disturbing noises leaking from within, methodical scraping like bone dragged across wood, and splintering thuds muffled but insistent, as though the artist himself was intent on exorcising something hidden deep within his walls. Candlelight flickered long into the early hours, sometimes, on moonless nights, shapes shuddered against the ragged curtains, shadows stretched to grotesque proportions. The very timbers seemed to creak in agony under the weight of whatever rituals happened just beyond the reach of reason. Some mornings, a thin film of wax or fine gold powder would coat the doorstep, swirling in little eddies, evidence of work both sacred and unholy. The gossips' tales began to grow teeth. Some said that Paolo's paintings whispered to one another, that the golden-sealed mouths would twitch when no one was looking. Others whispered of a curse infecting the blood of those immortalized by his hand. Children dared one another to peep through the slats during sittings, only to turn away pale, struck dumb by what they glimpsed, the living, frozen as statues, faces lit by a feverish gleam, their own images emerging behind them on the canvas, lips already robbed of voice before the final layers of lacquer were applied. Fewer and fewer dared to linger near Paolo's door after dusk, but his clientele, those hungry for eternity, kept coming, drifting in from far-off districts, faces eager but never returning the same as when they entered. City officials began to take notice. They watched as the old city's pulse faltered around Paolo's domain. Even the birds, once vibrant with morning song, now roost elsewhere, wind tangled with unspoken warnings, whipping the river's surface into a mirror of shattered light. And still, in that little studio, Paolo painted and painted, each portrait adding another frozen secret to his growing mausoleum of silence. The city held its breath, waiting to see what would ripple forth from that terrible hush, and in that waiting, an invisible cord drew tighter, preparing Florence for a reckoning that none would name but everyone felt, beating in their bones, trembling in their dreams, threatening to swallow every echo of mortal life with a single, golden, suffocating gasp. In the sodden heart of Florence, the year 1572 wore its gloom like a winding shroud, wrapping palazzi and hovels alike in a slow descent toward rot and forgetting. Beneath the battered roof of Paolo's peculiar studio, storms battered, rain tapping incessant, shadows dancing along warped timbers, and every window trembling with pent-up moans. But the true tempest unfolded inside, where the painter's hands, trembling and pale as candle wax, conjured a fever dream of color and silence on canvas. Layer upon layer, Paolo built his portraits into labyrinths of lacquer. Each stroke sealed secrets deeper than bone, the paint baked by time and the madness of his compulsion. The canvases glimmered with unnatural light, veins of gold winding beneath opalescent sheens of purple and red, ivory and black. Faces emerged, luminous and wretched, their features possessed by a terror barely glimpsed beneath the surface, noses chiseled and proud, brows heavy with immortal thought, but always the mouths, stifled, gilded, yearning toward a scream never heard. Paolo never spoke of what lived beneath the pigments, nor did he allow the world to see the ghostly underpaintings that haunted his process. Rumor was his currency. He spun it not from words, but from what he refused to share. In thunderous weather, a sacramental hush settled across the studio, painting itself into every line and pore. Children with sharp noses and sharper eyes sometimes loitered near the cracked foundation, peering through barnacle-crusted slits in the wall, daring one another to stare at the spectral faces within. Lightning raked down the sky, the city's lights flickered, and for a heartbeat, those painted visages seemed to twitch as if straining against their own golden cages, nostrils flaring with imagined breath, cheeks blanching, lips puckering as though desperate to tear through their lacquered bonds. The children ran, chilled to their marrow, stammering of phantoms and sorcery, but the adults, circumscribed by dread and pride, brushed their fears aside. No one wanted to believe art could carry menace into their own hearts. Paolo knew what he'd done. Most nights, after the last subject had departed and the city had recoiled into hush, he studied his finished works in candlelight. The air in his studio was thick with a smell as layered as his paint, honey and vinegar, burning lamp oil, traces of decay lingering in every draft. Sometimes he thought he could see movement in the thick lacquer, little muscles coiling beneath the gilded surface, the tiniest indication the portraits might wriggle free from their frames and become something else, something hideous and real. Some paintings grew heavier overnight. Gold seeped between canvas threads as if summoned from the artist's own veins, pooling in crescent shapes along jaws and chins. Days melted, nights bled together, and Paolo slipped further from the bustling city around him. He no longer flinched at thunder nor blinked when footsteps clattered outside his door. The only rhythm anchoring his existence was the steady brush, the endless layering, the hungry silence that followed each completion. Florentine matrons grew wary, though their husbands dismissed their trembling. A few dared approach Paolo with concern cloaked as curiosity. He never answered them, not directly. He gestured to the finished portraits, invited the city to bask in painted glory, and let the gathering silence do the rest. But even when displayed on lavish mantelpieces and in grand halls, the paintings cast unnatural shadows. Their eyes shone with preternatural depth, pupils reflecting the room in twisted, otherworldly angles. On stormy evenings, those who dwelt with Paolo's art swore that a tremor coursed through the gilded mouths. Sometimes, in the blue-black of midnight, the very skin seemed to peel away, exposing something raw and desperate beneath, something not strictly human. Children carried their warnings to the markets. A group of them, braver than most, gathered beneath a leaking awning, describing in shivers the things they'd seen, a nose wrinkling when no wind stirred, a gold-flecked lip rippling like pond water, a face that seemed to weep lacquer during thunder. Their parents dismissed these terrors, attributing them to feverish fantasy, but some, remembering the vanished patrons and the way the city seemed thinned by despair, locked the doors and muttered prayers under their breath. In Paolo's private hours, nightmare visions overtook him. He dreamt of his paintings writhing beneath his touch, bulging with shrieks and tears. The portraits clawed at him with invisible hands, painted nails gouged the frames, leaving ragged scratches. He awoke soaked in sweat, believing for a moment that he'd been devoured by his own creation, dissolved into gilded strokes. Yet even these tormenting visions could not keep him from his work. He painted feverishly, chasing immortal perfection while evading the cost he'd always felt mounting, cold and silent, just beyond what color could contain. As summer trudged in, thunderstorms became common, their violence echoing the roiling chaos in Paolo's studio and mind. On such nights, the city fell beneath an oppressive shroud. Even the rats scurried for cover, sensing a force greater than hunger. Through broken downspouts, rain hammered the studio's windows, and Paolo's unfinished portraits glistened in unnatural hues. When lightning illuminated the street, passers-by glimpsed the paintings flickering, twisting in their frames, drawing sharp breaths and holding them in abeyance. And each time, the rumor spread further, substantiating the city's darkest suspicions. Even the dead, once wine cask makers and bricklayers, turned in their graves, sensing the malignant pulse of Paolo's legacy. The final layer of lacquer was a ritual. Paolo poured the golden solution slowly, letting its viscous body crawl over the cheeks and eyebrows of the painted faces, sealing them anew. The studio filled with a pungent fog, heavy with the promise of silence and secrecy. Yet nothing could drown out the sense of looming catastrophe, the breathless anticipation lurking inside every golden mouth, every trembling eyelid on every canvas in the room. The day came when a ferocious storm, far worse than any that season, broke over Florence. Roof tiles splintered and alleyways overflowed. That night, the portraits came alive with shuddering malevolence. Those brave enough to pass by Paolo's building swore they heard muffled wails and scraping like nails against coffin wood, as if the paintings themselves begged to break loose. In one brief flash of thunder, the gold on the portraits shimmered with such force that it seemed to burst from the seams, curling and undulating, almost melting together. Children hiding in doorways saw painted skin bloom and writhe, as though some ancient grievance sought escape. Now the city could no longer disbelieve. The silent fear was no longer contained in whispers and half-glances, it bled, thick and noisy, through every street. The authorities conferred, clerics muttered in terror, and collectors locked their doors against a force neither understood nor acknowledged. Florence itself seemed to gasp and exhale with dreadful certainty, waiting for Paolo's heavy secret to detonate, a secret layered in gold and lacquer, buried in screaming silence, and destined to peel itself free from art and stain the world with something utterly irredeemable. Through all this, Paolo kept painting, caught between compulsion and horror, his hands now nearly translucent from the effort. But he did not confess. Instead, he trusted the silence, the lacquer, the storm, believing that if he painted fast enough, layer upon layer, something inside him might remain untouched. Yet on each new canvas, behind every golden seal, the faces shimmered with agony, desperate to break free, and somewhere in that silent cacophony, Florence pitched ever closer toward madness, breathless, transformed by terror, and unable to look away. The morning that shattered Paolo's sanctuary arrived brittle and thin, a silver mist clinging to the city as if Florence itself anticipated disaster. The bells of Santa Maria Novella tolled slow and heavy, their echoes dragging across rooftops slick with dew. In the chill that bled beneath every doorway, a procession began, priests moving single file, their cassocks swept by a wind that stank of resolve and old, scorched incense. Each face was pinched with intent, eyes burning beneath soot-black hoods, mouths set as if they alone could force silence back into its grave. They approached Paolo's studio at dawn, past stoop-shouldered beggars and vendors too frightened to leave their stalls. Witnesses darted glances from behind closed shutters, murmuring prayers neither for Paolo nor for the devout men but for the city itself, for the air seemed thick with threat. Outside the studio, the priests lit censers stuffed with myrrh and camphor, launching clouds of reeking smoke that curled along the walls like grasping hands. Their leader, Father Benedetto, raised a cracked silver cross and pressed his palm against the warped door, feeling the tremble of old wood and the faintest hiss as if something within recoiled from daylight. With a violent noise, they breached the sanctuary, candles stuttering in shock, dust spiraling, mice streaking for the safety of baseboards. Paolo's absence hung like a curse, scattering their bravery to the wind. In the center of the room, rows of canvases leaned against one another, tall and unnaturally heavy, close-set as if conspiring in secret rites. The priests drew closer, their robes brushing against vials and scraps of parchment, the scent of fear thickening with every step. The first painting lay shrouded in gold-stitched cloth, an aura of dread palpable even beneath the layers. Father Benedetto's trembling hands pulled it from the frame and began to peel back the lacquer, his breath shallow, the others craning forward as if drawn by the siren call of horror. The lacquer resisted, snapping and crackling with each slow tear, until an ugly slickness shone through, a patch of skin, unmistakably human, browned by time and tanned as if meant to last 100 winters. The skin carried odd markings, sigils burned into the flesh like mute curses, and in the very center, the painted mouth bled rivulets of molten gold. A cascade of shocked murmurs filled the room. Some priests staggered backwards against the wall, others gripped their censers as shields. Yet each painting concealed the same unspeakable secret. Father Benedetto ordered the canvases stripped methodically, and one by one, the skins revealed themselves in shining, dreadful sequence: backs, wrists, foreheads filigreed with sorrow, every mouth sewn or sealed, each mouth puckering with a metallic glimmer as drops of gold pooled in the cracks. The sun crawled higher, its weak light barely piercing the gloom. As the lacquer dissolved from the heavy frames, the air grew thick and buzzing. A low hum rose from the paintings themselves, as if hundreds of stolen voices waited to leap out and flood the narrow room with accusation. The priests, desperate to purify what they had unearthed, swung censers in wild arcs, ashes raining on the floor, the stench of myrrh overpowering but powerless to erase Paolo's handiwork. Outside, a crowd gathered, driven by rumors carried on the wind. Whispers raced up and down alleys, across stone bridges, through market squares. By midday, half the city pressed against the studio's crooked doorway, craning for a glimpse of the forbidden artworks, faces stricken with terror and awe. The priests redoubled their efforts, reciting psalms with cracked voices, their words jittering as the golden mouths on each patch of skin seemed to shimmer with fresh blood. Some spectators sobbed uncontrollably, clutching their own lips as if frightened they might join Paolo's collection. Others howled for the artist's arrest, denunciation, excommunication, demanding that Florence cleanse itself of this curse before it could claim any more souls. Amid the chaos, a young apprentice discovered an alcove hidden behind the mantelpiece, a cramped crypt cluttered with half-finished frames, broken mirrors, and twisted tools. Here, the corruption of Paolo's obsession reached its zenith. Shreds of skin nailed in careful rows, golden threads weaved through translucent flesh, tiny painted mouths shriveled to silence yet glimmering with venomous promise. The apprentice shrank away, muffling a cry, but the priests insisted on sanctifying every inch. Their voices vibrated through the walls, prayer and panic wound together, as if only by outlasting the painting's hum could they hope to reclaim the studio for God. As evening crept closer, rumors bred rumors. Some said Paolo had fled the city at dawn, others claimed he lurked beneath the studio, waiting to reclaim his creations, still others whispered that his soul had dissolved into pigment, cursed to wander gold and lacquer until eternity relented. The city shuddered beneath a blanket of unnatural calm, the bells rang, the light faded, but nowhere could anyone wholly forget the sight of real skin stretched across canvas, tattooed and weeping with gilded suffering. Florence itself seemed to gasp in horror, haunted by the impossible proof of Paolo's madness, by the revelation of art so secret it had to bleed to survive. The priests burned the shrouds and the empty frames before nightfall, their flames licking hungrily at the forbidden relics. But nothing quite erased the memory. Over the months that followed, families stopped commissioning portraits, old paintings vanished from hallways and hearths, strangers rained salt into cracks in the street. Some swore they heard muffled chatter late at night, a susurration of lips pressed in gold, a ghostly choir stranded between prayer and curse. Paolo remained a myth, an absence, a chill crawling over the city, but his work lingered, stamped on every shadow, echoing through every silence, a warning stitched forever into the fabric of Florence. In those brittle hours, when the priests finally returned to the monastery, it was said that the city's air tasted faintly of metal and regret. As if, somewhere beneath stone and candle, Paolo's golden mouth still hungered for words, and all of Florence would forever struggle to speak. Beyond the devastation of the studio door, through passages clogged with dust and despair, the priests pressed deeper, guided only by wavering candlelight and the bitter conviction that what awaited in Paolo's hidden sanctum could not be an accident of genius. The threshold to the next chamber was crumbled marble, its arch chiseled with old, weathered Florentine crests now smeared and indistinct. The room beyond sprawled in low, spectral gloom, shadows chained by the faint shuffle of priests' woolen shoes and the whisper of distant incantations attempting to keep terror at bay. There, beneath fallen arches that had once crowned the home of a noble family now lost to history, the full blasphemy of Paolo's intent became flesh. Along the cracked walls, dozens of vases, all sizes, some ornate and gleaming, others simple and rough, stood haphazard but clearly arranged. Each overflowed in grotesque abundance, severed fingers, pale and withered as candle wax, hands contorted, blackened nails pressed in sickly bouquets atop pools of silver lacquer. The stench was at once sweet and sharp, metallic and cloying, stealing into the lungs of the priests and choking resolve with every breath. It was not the odor of simple death, but of violation, a sweetness that clung like syrup and left a sour edge on the tongue. Between the mounds of lifeless tools, brushes split and bristling with long-dried paint, cloths stiff as boards, knives stained and corroded, Paolo's obsession with listening and feeling burst into dreadful clarity. Ears studded some receptacles, stacked like coins for passage to an unholy afterlife, while the scattered hands all seemed poised rather than thrown away, the fingers curled as if caught in the act of gripping brush or palette, yearning for creation in their stillness. The priests, shaken, recoiled from the implications, recalling the old whispers that Paolo insisted every touch of paint must capture the whisper of inspiration, that each ear had heard genius, every hand had helped birth a vision. The bodies had become collateral, trapped within art more consuming than any muse could ever demand. Lost whispers pulsed through the vaulted chamber, a chorus neither alive nor dead. The priests shut their ears but still felt the tickling surge of voices, muffled and plaintive, heartbroken and hungry, skittering between the marble pillars and trembling in pools of gold spilled on the cold flagstones. The hands and ears, if one looked long enough, cast a kind of spell, a confidence that the paint itself retained the memory of the flesh, a worry that the next stroke might bite, scratch, or scream. The apprentice, his nerves stretched beyond youth's usual endurance, crept to a corner where a heap of old sketchbooks lay sodden with waste. Flipping through their pages, he found drawings both profane and transcendent, fingers posed in every imaginable angle for holding brush, gripping a canvas, even tearing apart skin. Ears drawn in obsessive study, catalogued for their curvature and size, were annotated as if Paolo sought to divine which shape caught inspiration best. There were notes in faded ink, equations of color versus touch, proportions of gold to blood, the ledger of a man consumed not by the beauty of the world, but by its ability to be harvested. As the priests gathered courage to purify the space, their prayers seemed almost drowned in the spectral hum of memory, the hands and ears forming a silent choir, lamenting their brutal sacrifice in the name of creation. Some vases, toppled by hasty footsteps, spilled their contents in wet thuds onto the cold marble, the cacophony giving way to a terrifying quiet, as though even the lost fragments of flesh ached for silence. Rumors swelled in Florence before sunset. The market stalls faltered, word spread of Paolo's atrocities and his treasures of pain. It was said that those who helped sweep out the chamber refused to touch paint or brush ever again, and many swore that fingers sometimes twitched in the night, that ears, those stacked like pallid lilies, would begin to sweat a slick film when storms shook the city. Children grew quiet, staring at the hands of artists with a strange dread. The city's painters found themselves the object of wary glances and concealed scorn, the innocent now tainted by Paolo's unthinkable legacy. Through it all, the hands and ears in the marble chamber persisted, a monument to Paolo's faith that true genius required the sacrifice not just of time and hope, but of actual flesh and listening. They remained, evidence dissolving into myth, a grotesque orchestra cursed to play on in the dark, their longing for paint and creation now forever twisted into the city's story, leaving Florence not only haunted but transformed, its beauty now inexorably entangled with horror, each brushstroke echoing the plea of hands and ears forever longing to live again. After the day the priests gutted Paolo's sanctuary, Florence exhaled, but the tremor lived on beneath its facades, a persistent sickness that neither fire nor prayer could fully cauterize. Paolo himself vanished, dissolved into rumor, his fate debated in every alleyway and behind every shutter. Some swore he drowned himself in the Arno the moment before the church descended. Others believed he clawed his way through the crypts beneath the city to emerge elsewhere, changed or lost or never truly mortal. The truth blurred beneath the city's anxious heartbeat, merging with matters of faith and nightmares as easily as blood mingled with rain in the gutter. Florence tried to forget. Old portraits were burned by anxious heirs, every painter questioned, the sermons thick with fearful parables. Each night, the bells told an extra stroke, just in case a ghost wandered too close to home. Still, sometimes, a waft of incense, so sharp it stung the eyes, would drift on the breeze, as if a billowing vestige of unresolved sin. When storms muddied the sky over the Arno, golden streaks shivered across the water, flashes so unnatural they seemed painted by an unsteady god. On those nights, citizens bolted their doors early and dragged children away from the riverbank, but some, peering from behind latticework, swore they saw a shape pass under the Ponte Santa Trinita, trailing a cloud of gold dust in its wake. Days bled together. The city's rhythm stuttered. Fewer singers haunted the piazzas, and laughter, rare and brittle, cracked at the edges, as if the very notion of joy risked being sealed behind a lacquered silence. Yet it was the windows that held the secret wounds. When the moon was thin or storms tangled with the city's towers, a peculiar trick of light danced on the glass. Faces blinked in flickering gold, spectral, silent, transfixed by the horror of revelation. Some households woke to find filmy smears across their panes, as if an unseen mouth had pressed there, desperate to speak or to warn. Whispers wound their way into legend. People spoke of cursed reflections. If a person gazed too long, they might see their own visage ages hence, lips pressed shut by an unseen hand, eyes wide with sorrow. There were those who claimed to hear a faint susurrus, a whisper that slithered down the hallways at night, secrets once sealed on canvas now blooming in the corners of empty rooms. Sometimes, whole families fled a house in fear after waking to find the golden shadow of a hand stretching across the floor at dawn. Centuries passed in the hush of avoidance, but the story never quite died. Occasionally, gold filings surfaced in river mud or in the cracks between paving stones in the city's oldest quarter. Children dared one another to fetch such fragments, then threw them away in terror, convinced they heard faint cries from the filigree, cries that lodged in their ears and haunted their sleep. Artists grew wary of capturing more than flesh, terrified of conjuring what Paolo had unleashed. Some destroyed their own canvases just to be safe. In the hush before sunrise, ancient windows still gathered a faint, golden sheen after certain storms, a shimmer never scrubbed away. On those mornings, the streets of Florence felt thinner, poised between memory and nightmare. If anyone listened closely as they walked near the Arno on these rare, haunted dawns, they might catch the faintest echo, an intake of breath, the glimmer of unseen faces, a sigh that was neither wind nor soul but the secret that never truly left, waiting, pressed forevermore behind immaculate, silent glass.